The laugh for the first thing everyone remembered. Not the numbers, not the legal terms. The laugh. Sharp, dry, wrong. It cut through a courtroom like a blade the momentos charges were read aloud. Fraud, predatory lending, elder exploitation. On paper, it looked cold, technical. But when the court clerk finished, the man at the defense table did something no one in that room expected. He smiled. Then he laughed. Low at first, then louder. A banker's laugh, polished, mocking, completely out of place under fluorescent lights and solemn eyes. His name was Leonard Drake, regional director, 49 years old, tailored suit, cufflinks heavy enough to pay a month's rent. A tie-pin bearing the discreet emblem of his bank. For 2 decades, people like him had sat on panels, given interviews, and talked about financial literacy and responsible lending. For 2 decades, men like him had smiled as they signed documents that would crush people who never even saw the ink. Now, finally, he sat somewhere else. Not at the head of a boardroom table, not in a private office with floor-to-ceiling glass, in a courtroom, in front of Judge Joseph Wapner. And in his mind, it was all still a misunderstanding, an inconvenience, an error of perception that a few well-placed words and a controlled smirk could fix. He didn't understand yet that the numbers on those documents had finally done something he never thought possible. They had turned on him. Leonard sat with the posture of someone who believed in his own superiority. Back straight, shoulders relaxed, one arm casually draped over the back of his chair as if this was just another quarterly earnings meeting. He was handsome in the way wealth lets you be. Sharp jawline, salt and pepper hair perfectly groomed, skin that had never been burned by factory lights or harsh chemicals. His eyes were a piercing steel blue, cold, measuring. He wore confidence like a second skin. Near him, his attorney shifted uncomfortably. He had warned Leonard, this court wasn't a negotiation room. This judge wasn't a client. This was not the place to perform arrogance. But Leonard listened like he listened to most people beneath his pay grade, barely. His gaze swept the courtroom. He saw the cameras first. He always did. Reporters, local news, a few independent videographers who smelled a story bigger than the usual civil dispute. Then he noticed the gallery. Not just suits, not just press. Faces. Ordinary. Tight with anger, fear, curiosity. He recognized some of them, or thought he did. A teller from a small branch fired after trying to flag irregularities in a report. A former client, an older man, red-eyed and stiff. A young woman with a binder on her lap, knuckles white where they gripped the edges. He didn't remember their names. He remembered their accounts, their balances, their ratios. People were numbers to him. They always had been. Now, those numbers sat in wooden benches, breathing, waiting, watching. Judge Joseph Wapner entered. All rise. Everyone stood. Leonard rose last, by a fraction of a segundo. The delay was deliberate, a reminder to himself that he did things on his own time, that he was in control. Even here, especially here, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The charges were deceptively simple when distilled. Drake, as regional director, had overseen a program of specialized financial products targeting seniors and low-income clients. The brochures were friendly, soft colors, smiling faces, words like security, flexibility, peace of mind. The contracts were not friendly. Buried clauses, hidden fees, variable interest rates that jumped like a trap once the promotional period ended, reverse mortgages branded as equity unlocks, high-interest bridge loans pitched as short-term relief. If you read the documents from start to finish with a lawyer at your elbow and a magnifying glass, everything was technically disclosed. Paper, covered. But the reality? People signed. People trusted. People lost. Homes, savings, dignity. Not in one explosive scandal, slowly, quietly, one foreclosure at a time. One unfortunate default at a time. One compliance-approved phone script at a time. Until someone finally said, "No, enough." Her name was Ruth Calder, 74, widowed. She had gone to the bank for help when medical bills began to choke her. Her husband's pension, her savings, her home, all tied up in a system she barely understood. Leonard's people had offered her a solution. He had signed off on it. A retirement optimization package. It was supposed to keep her safe. Instead, within 18 months, she'd received a foreclosure notice on the house she'd lived in for 42 years. By then, she'd already paid more in fees and interest than the original help she'd been offered. The math didn't make sense to her. It made perfect sense to him. Because every lost home, every repossessed asset, every late fee had turned into numbers on a spreadsheet that spelled one thing for him: bonus. Now those numbers were being read back to him, line by line, in a courtroom. And he laughed because he believed, with everything in him, that these things were too complicated for ordinary people to understand. That Judge Wapner would listen to terms like risk-based pricing and informed consent and decide this was something for regulatory boards, not for judgment. To him, this wasn't crime. It was business. The prosecution didn't see it that way. They moved through their presentation with precision. No theatrics, just facts. Internal emails showed branch managers pressured to push high-margin products to vulnerable segments. Slides from Leonard's own presentations listed older homeowners and cash-strapped families under key opportunity demographics. Scripts for phone calls emphasized, "Don't overcomplicate the explanation." Training materials advised staff to reassure, not explain, when clients seemed confused. The numbers followed. Default rates in districts under Leonard's control, foreclosure patterns, a spike in repossessions tied directly to the rollout of his innovation strategy. They weren't saying he'd stolen money from a vault. They were saying he'd designed a system that legally siphoned value from people who couldn't afford to lose it, then smiled when they did, and made more money with every life that crumbled. As Ruth sat in the witness stand, hands shaking, describing the day men knocked on her door to pin a foreclosure notice under her porch light, Leonard looked bored. He glanced at his watch, tugged at his cuff, whispered something to his attorney with a faint smirk. The gallery learned another important thing about him then. He didn't just lack remorse, he lacked imagination. He could not, for a second, imagine himself on her side of anything. He had spent so long on the upper floors of buildings that he had forgotten what the ground felt like. Judge Wapner saw it all. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He just watched. Like a man who had seen variations of this arrogance more times than he could count, and knew exactly how to dismantle it. When it was the defense's turn, Leonard's lawyer stood, smooth, practiced. He spoke not about pain, about process. He framed Leonard not as a predator, but as a professional, an executive who oversaw policy, not individual cases. He emphasized complexity, regulation, compliance. The products were legal, he said. Regulators were aware. Everything was disclosed. He leaned heavily on one idea: personal responsibility. These clients signed contracts, he said. They had the opportunity to read, to ask questions, to consult counsel. Banks cannot operate if we are expected to hold every customer's hand through every clause. That is not how the system works. He gestured at Ruth, at others like her, softening his voice. "Mrs. Calder's situation is tragic," he said. "No one disputes that. But tragedy is not the same as fraud. We cannot equate regret with illegality." Leonard sat back, satisfied. This was familiar. Strategy, deflection. He'd sat on enough internal review committees to know how this played. At worst, a fine, a few policy changes, a supervised agreement to do better, perhaps a quiet suspension, followed by a consulting role somewhere else. People like him did not go down. They transitioned. He adjusted his tie, straightened his posture, prepared mentally for the polite slap on the wrist and the eventual corporate governance improvements press release. He was still thinking like a banker. He hadn't realized yet that in this room, the exchange rate was different. His confidence had no value here. His status was not collateral. And the man on the bench did not take meetings. He gave them, in the form of sentencing. When Leonard took the stand, the atmosphere tightened. He walked with measured, controlled steps, not rushed, not timid, hands folded neatly as he swore the oath. He sat with the poise of someone used to media appearances. He had given interviews on business channels. He had testified before legislative committees as a subject matter expert. He knew how to sound intelligent without ever sounding guilty. His lawyer led him through predictable ground. His education, his career, his commitment to the institution, the number of jobs his region provided, the philanthropic projects he'd supported. He talked about charity drives, scholarship funds, loan forgiveness initiatives for small but meaningful numbers of struggling debtors. It was a familiar dance. Point to a few bright spots. Hope no one notices the darkness they cast shadows over. Then they moved to the allegations. He used words like regrettable outcomes, operational oversights, unfortunate miscommunications, always passive, never "I did," always "it happened." He insisted he never intended for anyone to lose their home, that he trusted compliance, that he would never knowingly approve something exploitative. His tone oozed reasonableness, measured, calm, reassuring. But under the table, his foot tapped occasionally. Tiny bursts of impatience, irritation. It was there in his eyes, too. Every time Ruth's name came up. Every time elderly clients were mentioned. Every time the word predatory floated in the air. By the time his lawyer finished, Leonard felt satisfied. He believed he'd done what he always did. Fogged the edges, impressed the room, made everything sound too complicated, too technical for anyone to really blame him. He had forgotten something critical. This was not a shareholders' meeting. This was not a subcommittee hearing. This was Joseph Wapner's courtroom. And Wapner was not here to be impressed by complexity. He was here to cut through it. "Mr. Drake," Judge Wapner began, leaning slightly forward, "you have spoken at length about systems, about compliance, about oversight. I'd like to talk about you." The shift was subtle, but decisive. Leonard nodded, trying to maintain that calm, slightly condescending composure. "Of course, Your Honor." The judge picked up a stack of printed emails, he said, "sent from your account, approved by you. In this one, you are discussing the rollout of the retirement optimization package." He read, voice flat. "This segment represents a substantial upside. Seniors sit on untapped equity and respond well to security-driven language. We should avoid overwhelming them with terms, focus on reassurance and ease. Our goal is to move assets from static to active products with higher yield." He set the paper down. The courtroom felt colder. "Is that an accurate quote?" he asked. Leonard shifted. "It appears to be yes," he said, "but that's just standard market analysis." "Standard," Wapner repeated softly. "For whom?" Leonard blinked. I don't understand." "You refer to seniors," the judge said, "as this segment, to their homes and savings as untapped equity, to their confusion as something to be avoided, not resolved, avoided. Don't overwhelm them with terms." His gaze sharpened. "That is not the language of protection," he said. "That is the language of exploitation." A murmur rippled through the gallery, subdued, but there. Leonard's jaw tightened. "With respect," he replied, a trace of steel entering his tone. "That's your interpretation, Your Honor. In this industry, we categorize markets. It's how we function. It doesn't mean we wish them harm." "In this industry," Wapner said, "you also took homes." The words dropped like lead. Heavy, undeniable. He lifted another document. "This," he said, "is a foreclosure list from your region last year. Dozens of properties, many tied to your optimization products, several belonging to people over 65. He glanced toward Ruth. Her hands, in her lap, clenched around a folded handkerchief. "You knew," he said, eyes back on Leonard, "that this was happening." "We operate within guidelines," Leonard began. Wapner cut him off. "Answer the question," he said. "Did you know that these products were leading to a disproportionate number of foreclosures among older clients?" Leonard's nostrils flared. He was not used to being spoken to like this, not by anyone. "Yes," he said at last. "I was aware of the numbers. We monitored performance." "Performance," the judge said. "An interesting word for the loss of someone's home." Leonard's throat bobbed. He shrugged slightly. "They signed," he said. "We didn't force anyone. They made choices." There it was, the core of him, naked, ugly. The courtroom went very still. A man in the back shook his head slowly, lips curling in disgust. Someone else muttered under their breath, "There it is." Ruth squeezed her eyes shut. For months, she had wondered if she'd been stupid, blind. Now, hearing him say it out loud like that, they made choices. She felt a different realization. No, she hadn't been stupid. She had been targeted. Judge Wapner's expression didn't change, but something in the room did. An invisible line had been crossed. "Mr. Drake," he said quietly, "how many pages are in the average contract for one of these products?" Leonard frowned. I'm not sure. 30, perhaps? 40? "How big is the font?" the judge asked. A few people in the gallery allowed themselves the smallest, bitterest smiles. They knew where this was going. "Standard size," Leonard said. "I don't handle the formatting." "Standard," Wapner said again. "For lawyers, for executives, not for 74-year-old widows trying to keep a roof over their heads." Leonard shifted. "I can't be held responsible for every individual's level of understanding. If they don't read, that's not on me. That's—" He stopped. Too late. The slip had already happened. The contempt, the blame, out in the open now for everyone to see. The judge didn't raise his voice. It didn't need to. "Not on you," he repeated. "Not your problem, just your profit." The line cut. Clean. You could see it land on Leonard's face, on Ruth's, on every person who'd walked into that bank believing the language at the door. "We're here to help." For a long moment, Judge Wapner said nothing. He just looked at him. Not like an executive, like a defendant, like a man. "You sit there," he said finally, "and you talk about contracts, about signatures, about choices. You use the law as a shield. It was disclosed. It was allowed. He leaned forward slightly. "I am here to tell you," he continued, voice like iron wrapped in velvet, "that the law is not your shield. Not today. Not in my courtroom." The phrase reverberated. The law is not your shield. He picked up another file. "This case," he said, "is not about whether banks can make money. It is about how far they can go before their profit becomes predation. It is about what happens when someone in your position forgets that the people behind the numbers are not variables in a portfolio, but human beings." His gaze shifted to the gallery, to Ruth, to the former teller, to the young woman with the binder. "People like Mrs. Calder," he said, "entrusted your institution with their savings, their homes, their futures. They walked into branches with your logo on the wall and believed the man in the suit knew more than they did and would use that knowledge to help them." He turned back to Leonard. "You used that trust," he said, "as leverage." He let that accusation hang. "You did not technically break into that homes in the middle of the night," he continued. "You did something worse. You convinced them to hand you the keys." Leonard's lips thinned. His eyes flickered with heat. For all his composure, all his training, all his expensive representation, he was not handling this well. Because Wapner was cutting at the only thing he truly valued: his belief in his own moral distance. He liked to think he was different from thieves, from criminals. He wore a suit. He spoke well. He sat on boards. Now, this man was telling him, in front of cameras and witnesses, that beneath all of that, he was something else. A taker of homes, of security, of peace. The defense tried one last time to reroute. "Your Honor," the attorney interjected, "we must distinguish between bad optics and illegality. If we start criminalizing every aggressive financial product—" "Aggressive," Wapner snapped, fixing him with a sharp look. He turned back to Leonard. "Mr. Drake," he said, "did you receive performance-based compensation tied to the sale of these products?" Leonard hesitated. Then, "Yes." "Did your bonus," the judge pressed, "increase as more of these loans were sold in your region?" "Yes," Leonard said again, stiffly. "So," Wapner concluded, "every time Monsignor signed one of your optimizations contracts, every time a family took out one of your flexible relief loans, your compensation grew." Silence. "Yes," Leonard said, teeth gritted. "And when those same contracts led to foreclosure," the judge asked, "when those families lost their homes—" Leonard swallowed. "The losses," he said, "were factored into overall performance. We manage risk." "Risk," Wapner said. "Whose?" He didn't give him time to answer. "These people lost everything," he said. "You lost nothing. You were paid either way." He straightened. "This is not risk-sharing," he said. "This is risk-shifting from the institution that could absorb it to the individuals who could not." He lifted the ruling documents. "The question before this court," he said, "is whether your conduct was merely unethical or unlawful." He let the word hang. Unlawful. Leonard's smirk finally died completely. Something colder slid into its place. Fear. "You may think," Wapner continued, voice now carrying a steel the room hadn't yet heard, "that because you never physically touched these people's belongings, because you never raised your voice, because you never stepped foot on their porches as the foreclosure notices went up, you are somehow distant from the harm." He shook his head. "You are not." He pointed to the list of addresses again. "You designed the policy," he said. "You approved the training. You watched the numbers climb. You called it performance. He tapped the paper once. "In this courtroom," he said, "we call it something else. Fraud." It wasn't shouted, but everyone heard it. "Fraud through misrepresentation," he elaborated. "Fraud through omission. A pattern of deliberately obscuring the true risk and cost of these products from the very people least equipped to uncover that truth." Leonard's attorney started to object. Wapner didn't let him. "Sit down, counsel," he said evenly. "You've had your say." The lawyer sat, slowly, eyes down. He knew. The tide had fully turned. There was no recourse now but damage control, no path but through. "Mr. Drake," the judge said, "you spoke earlier about choices, about signatures, about how you cannot be held responsible for what people choose to sign." He leaned forward. "For once," he said, "this is about your signature, your choices." His next words were like ice. "This court finds you guilty." You could almost hear the split-second twitch in Leonard's jaw as the word hit. Guilty. It had never been attached to him before, not like this, not officially, not permanently, not recorded in a way he couldn't amend, erase, or manage. Guilty. The gallery reacted, not with cheers, this wasn't a movie, but with a collective, visceral exhale, tension that had coiled in their shoulders, their jaws, their fists, finally releasing. Some gripped the benches, some closed their eyes. Ruth pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. Her shoulders shook. This time, she didn't bother to hide it. She had been doubting herself for so long. Now, someone else had carried the weight of those doubts. It turned them into something solid. Not just outrage, verdict. But the moment everyone would remember for years wasn't just the word guilty. It was what came after, the punishment. The punishment that made even Leonard Drake's carefully constructed composure crack in full view of the cameras. "Given the scope of harm," Wapner said, "the number of individuals affected, and the deliberate nature of your conduct, this court must impose a sentence that reflects not only the damage done, but the message that must be sent." He looked at Leonard. "You believed," he said, "that the complexity of your work insulated you, that numbers and clauses could shield you from accountability, that the law was a tool for you to use, not something that could be used on you." He shook his head once. "In this courtroom," he said, "the law is not your instrument. It is your boundary." He drew a breath. "For your actions," he continued, "you are sentenced to a term of incarceration in state custody." The courtroom stilled. Prison? For a bank director? It didn't happen. Not like this. Not often. Not enough. Leonard's eyes widened. His nostrils flared. "That's absurd," he blurted before he could stop himself, the mask shattering. I'm not some criminal off the street. There it is," someone whispered in the back. "There he is." The contempt, the hierarchy etched into his bones. "I am not one of them." Joseph Wapner's gaze hardened. "Mr. Drake," he said, voice like a slammed door, "you will not speak again unless you are asked a direct question." Leonard's attorney placed a firm hand on his arm. "Stop," he hissed under his breath. But it was too late. The cameras had seen the panic, the crack, the fear. They had finally seen Leonard Drake without his armor of boardrooms and jargon. Just a man confronted with the reality he had believed was reserved for others. For criminals off the street. Not for him. Never for him. Until now. The judge wasn't finished. In addition to incarceration, he said, you are ordered to pay significant restitution, not symbolic, substantial, to a fund dedicated to assisting those you and your policies harmed. He named an amount that made even Leonard flinch. To most people, it was an unimaginable sum. To a man like him, it was something else, a direct hit, not to his cash flow, to his illusion of invulnerability. You will be permanently barred, Wapner went on, from serving in any fiduciary capacity. No directorships, no advisory roles, no employment in banking or financial services. Leonard's skin blanched. This was more than a sentence. It was exile from the only world he knew. You built a career, the judge said, on being trusted with other people's money. You have proven beyond question that you are not worthy of that trust. He paused, then delivered the last blow. And this court will recommend, he added, that your conviction be reportado to all relevant regulatory and licensing bodies, both Stato and Federal. It was a long way of design. Your name will not be buried. It will be broadcast, indexed, tied forever to what you did. He would not, in a year or two, discreetly slide onto another board under another name. He would be marked, publicly, permanently. The law, Wapner said quietly, is not just a set of rules. It is a memory. Today, it will remember you as a man who treated people's lives as mere columns on a balance sheet. Leonard's breathing quickened. For the first time since he walked in, he looked small. His shoulders, once so square, slumped. His eyes darted, searching for someone to appeal to, a partner, a colleague, a superior. There was no one, only the bench, the clerk, the bailiff approaching with a pair of handcuffs in his palm. Reality, closing in. The gallery watched, rapt, some with satisfaction, some with haunted reflection. They had lost things they would never get back. Homes, credit, peace. No sentence could replace them. But seeing this man, this symbol of the system that had chewed them up, actually be led away, it did something. Not revenge, not relief exactly, just correction. A slight, necessary tilt back towards something that felt like it had been leaning hard in the wrong direction for far too long. Ruth wiped her eyes. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering about next steps. She barely heard him. Her focus was on the man who had laughed at her pain, who now couldn't seem to find his breath. As the bailiff fastened the cuffs around Leonard's wrists, his composure buckled fully. His lips trembled, his eyes widened. He shook his head once, twice, as if trying to dislodge the reality pressing down on him. "This is insane," he muttered. To no one, to everyone. He sounded less like a director now, more like any other defendant. Like any other person who had thought they were beyond reach until they felt the metal on their skin. He looked at the judge one last time, as if willing him to reconsider, to look at his suit, his resume, his world, and see someone who deserved softer ground. Wapner's face remained unreadable. "You laughed at the charges," he said softly. "You're not laughing now." The line would later become the video's title in 100 reposts. Not laughing now. The cameras seized it. The internet would devour it. But in that room, it wasn't a punchline. It was a fact. A simple, devastating fact. As Leonard was led toward the side door, the distance between him and the man he'd been when he walked in grew with each step. He had entered amused, certain, untouchable. He left shaken, marked, contained. Behind him, the courtroom did not erupt in applause. It simply breathed, deeply. People gathered their belongings slowly. Some approached Ruth to squeeze her hand, to tell her she'd been brave, to thank her even for taking on a system they'd always thought was too big to fight. She nodded, numbed. The emotional weight would take time to fully register. But as she walked out, past the seal of the court, past the cameras, past the reporters shouting questions, she felt something she hadn't felt since the day she'd gotten that first foreclosure notice: dignity. Inside, Judge Wapner finished his paperwork. One case among hundreds. Important, not unique. He knew there were more Leonard Drakes out there, in other suits, in other buildings, designing new ways to frame extraction as service. He couldn't catch them all, but he had caught this one, and he had done what his position required. Not to make a point, not to go viral, simply to say, here, at least here, your money cannot laugh your way out of this. Here, the law has teeth. And when you spend years sinking those teeth into the most vulnerable around you, one day, if the right evidence hits the right file at the right time, it can bite back hard.